Well, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whatever it is for you. And welcome to the space. We're going to kind of create this in a circle-ish format, using some of the principles of circle to guide our conversation today. And that means starting off with just a welcome and we're glad you're here. Thank you for being here. And also just a statement about the purpose. Like the purpose today is explicitly to have an honest and in-depth conversation about the impact of whiteness on restorative justice and about what we can do to decenter and dismantle whiteness in restorative justice. Dorothy.
Thank you. So we do want to begin with 3 acknowledgements. And I think I would like to just start off by saying when I woke up this morning, I put my feet on the floor, which is attached to the ground, on stolen land that belongs to the BIPOC, who no longer live physically in this world, as well as the Mi'kmaq. And I want to acknowledge the Innu and the Inuit of Labrador. And ultimately, I want to acknowledge the failure that we often make, the failure to acknowledge Indigenous and Afro-Indigenous roots of restorative justice.
We also want to take just a moment and acknowledge just the harms that are experienced by colonization and imperialism, patriarchy, and that commitment to Western ideologies that often get symbolized in violence and oppression. Namely, most recently, the recent murders of George Floyd and Daunte Wright, and also just the continual extractive practices that impact the resource rights of Indigenous people globally. Just want to take a moment and acknowledge that.
And then we also want to acknowledge the continual harm that happens for Black and Brown children and youth in our schools, even in the implementation of restorative justice. We have seen often, especially in the last couple of years, how what we think we are doing in restorative justice education has not resulted in better, well, has the disproportionality has continued. And so we want to really acknowledge that and witness that reality. And in those 3 acknowledgements, we are placing this session tonight on interrogating whiteness.
Oftentimes conversations like these can be perceived as and entered into with some trepidation, fear. And so I think it behooves us to take a moment and make sure that we are bringing our very best selves to a space. And so I would invite us just to a moment of silence, reflection, and opportunity to center ourselves, ground ourselves, focus on the things that will help us to have a good conversation. Thinking about some of the values that guide us as restorative justice practitioners. Namely, that we show up humble and receptive, courageous, teachable, honoring, compassionate, curious. If there are others that you feel like you want to name, go ahead and name those. Thank you.
And in this space, we commit to deep listening, where deep listening is understanding that we listen with the full expectation that we may need to change. And I'd like to begin with this quote by Dr. Martin Luther King. We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. So we're really thankful to be able to be here together as a group, not a huge group, but that's okay. And there comes Laura. We may have people dropping in as we go. Our process tonight is basically for Kathy, Skye, Sheryl, and I to complete 4 rounds. And after each round, where each of us will speak briefly, we will then dialogue about the ideas that we've heard from each other amongst the 4 of us. And then we'll move on to a next question or prompt. And we have 4 before us, but we'll see how the time goes. We would like to invite you to, in the chat, post any questions that you don't want to forget that come up for you as you are listening, or feel free to jot them down, and every once in a while we will pause and perhaps acknowledge those questions, and Skye is going to monitor those questions, or we will wait till the end. And we are anticipating going for about an hour of dialogue with these rounds, and then having between 15 minutes and 30 minutes of Q&A dialogue time with us as a whole group. We'll see how things evolve, and as to whether we'll be here for an hour or whether we'll be here for 75 minutes or 90 minutes, but whatever happens, happens. And so at this point also, I'd like to just welcome Laura and Jan Adams to the group, and just really thankful for this time that we can be together. So we're going to start off actually with an introductory round of where each of us is going to introduce ourselves briefly. We actually forgot about this. We said this in the breakout room before we started. We said, are we going to introduce ourselves? Anyway, so I'm going to hand the talking piece over to Kathy to introduce herself. Okay, go ahead, Kathy.
Thanks, Dorothy. Hi, all. I'm Kathy Evans. I'm Associate Professor of Education at Eastern Mennonite University, where I teach teachers about restorative justice, both at the undergrad and the grad level. I've been at EMU now for about 10 years. In fact, this is my year 10, and been doing restorative justice for about 13, 14 years. And I'm really grateful to be here with you. And I'll pass the talking piece to Skye.
Hi, everyone. I am Skye. I am from Brampton, Ontario, Canada. So I am on the land of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Ojibwe Chippewa, and the Anishinaabe peoples, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. So, so that's the land that I am on as of today. I am an equity resource teacher for one of the larger school boards in Ontario and one of the most diverse school boards. And my position is actually a new role that's been created that will focus specifically on Black student success. There's been a lot of challenges in our board and an investigation into overwhelming evidence of anti-Black racism that has posed some challenges and some changes that are being made within our board. And so my position will be to support schools, to support educators in doing the work to address anti-Black racism. So I am really excited and looking forward to being here and diving into this conversation today. And I will pass the talking piece to Sheryl.
Hello, everyone. I am Sheryl Wilson. I am coming to you from North Newton, Kansas, which is about half an hour north of Wichita. And we're probably right in the middle of the United States. This is the land of many First Nation groups. Those that are included in that number are the Kansa, the Kiowa, the Comanche, and Wichita. And these lands that I am on are the ones that these tribes have occupied. And we pay homage to them today. And we very much owe the heritage that we have in terms of the practices. I try very hard to connect with these groups regularly. And I would just like to share that my background here is at the Kansas Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution at Bethel College, a small Mennonite institution that this Peace Building Institute rests on. And we do a lot of work in our state implementing restorative practices in various public schools, K-12 schools around the state of Kansas. So that is part of my orientation here. The other part of it has to do with some of the work that I feel very privileged to have written a chapter in Colorizing Restorative Justice, a publication that was put out last year by Living Justice Press. My chapter is called Calling Out Whiteness, and a lot of that is related to my work as a practitioner of restorative justice in the field. I've been doing this work for nearly 20 years. So with that, I will pass it back to you, Dorothy.
Thanks, Sheryl. Yeah, so I am located on the very tip of the North American continent in a little town called Pooch Cove, Newfoundland and Labrador. I was born and raised in Ontario, Canada, and I was a K through 8 teacher for about 20 years before I started my graduate work. I came to restorative justice through my children, Anthony and Chris, who were in grades 5, 6, 7, 8 around the time of Columbine. And in Canada, we also think about the Tabor incident around the same time. And as a result, everything went into zero tolerance mode here. And so as my husband and I found our children home more often than they needed to be, because they had been pushing on the playground or shoving or whatever. And so that was a time, that was where I was first realized how much impact suspension had on a child, on his sibling, on his siblings, on us as a family, and on us as a community, and our place in that community. And I just realized how problematic that was. After about the 4th time, our oldest was suspended. A good friend gave us one of the first articles written about restorative justice in education, and it changed my life. And just really, in a lot of ways, I came to understand life in a way that I never had before, and it helped me understand unconditional love. So after I did my PhD, I got a job here in Newfoundland. Never dreamt that I'd be living here, but it's a great place to live. And I've had the opportunity to introduce restorative justice in schools here in a very holistic way. Not interestingly enough, in Newfoundland and Labrador, if you ask teachers, educators what restorative justice is, they will tell you it's about developing relational schools. And in fact, they are actually quite afraid of using restorative justice for harm in difficult conversations. And that's a hurdle we have to get over. I'm also very, very conscious of my settler Canadian identity, and realizing that in that identity, it is bred in my bone to be a colonizer, and that's a constant battle. And part of that is why we have initiated this panel, but I find myself working a whole lot more with Indigenous peoples of this land, and it's just a really encouraging thing. Okay, Kathy, you want to set us up for the first question, or am I doing that?
I don't mind, I can do that. So
Go for it.
we wanted to start with just talking about the ways in which whiteness has impacted our understanding and our implementation, our work in restorative justice. And so that's kind of the question: how has whiteness impacted restorative justice? And I'll pass to Skye.
Thanks. I first was really, introduced, I guess, to restorative justice when I was working in a youth correctional facility where the school was in the facility. So we would go into that facility. The boys that were there, they were male young offenders between 14 and 18. It was a closed custody facility, so they stayed on site. But they wanted all the teachers to be trained, and I say trained, I don't know, I need a different word to use, but in restorative practices. And the idea was that all the staff had to be, have the familiarity with restorative practices in order to build more meaningful relationships with students. And, for me, I think what I saw is it naturally worked for me to have a restorative justice philosophy. But even still, there were things that I did and said that, based on the way that I've grown up through school system and being in a very colonized structured schooling, I still was trying to adapt and frame things in a way that wasn't beneficial to all students. And so I started to kind of veer away from what the rigid framework was that we had been trained to do. So an example that I will give in terms of how whiteness has played out in restorative justice is that, when we've taken a practice that has been rooted in Indigenous and Afro-Indigenous communities that centers on community relationships, working together, connecting with everybody within that community in order to ensure that no harm continues. And we've taken that practice and focused mostly or heavily on, a script, a conference, a way to control and manage student behavior. We really, created a practice that isn't what restorative justice ever was. And, working in that facility, I saw many students in those 3 years who were facing 20-day suspensions in a correctional facility, 20-day suspensions. I saw repeatedly students getting removed from class. Could have been, they stuck up a middle finger at somebody, or they said something and the teacher was not comfortable with it. And so a lot of the times there was still heavy removal of students from classes over suspensions in a facility that there really shouldn't be suspensions. And so I realized that the practice wasn't working to what it was supposed to be about. And the challenge with that is that as educators, when we're coming into a space and not really wanting to build those meaningful relationships and understanding student experience and where they're coming from without judgment or fear or, limitations to what their experiences are, we can't build meaningful relationships. And that is foundational to the practice. And so, whiteness played out a lot through restorative practices because, a lot of educators have the inability to really see the humanity in the students that are in front of them. I would hear teachers say, they're just criminals. They're from this area, and they would refer to it. I don't know if they do this in the States, but in Canada, there's certain intersections, especially in Toronto, that they will say, and they are very stigmatized neighborhoods, that they would say that this particular youth is from this particular community. And as a result, that projection of what they think of that neighborhood or that student, no matter what he has done, is getting projected into the classroom and is further preventing those authentic relationships with students. And, being in that facility, you saw such a high social IQ from especially the Black youth. I mean, 80 to 90%, I would say 90% of the youth in this facility were Black. And that was hard for me with having three teenage boys the same age as these young men. And, you know, it just was surprising to me that, you know, the guys that were in there with such social high cues, they would come in right away and they would be able to say, that teacher doesn't like me. That teacher is racist. That teacher has a problem with me. Because just with a small, short interaction, they could already see the bias that was coming off of the educator in terms of their relationship with one another. So, you know, whiteness really does play out in terms of the relationship piece of how we're connecting with Black and Brown and student and other students who are racialized. And it also plays out in the implementation process. So, you know, what I was saying about, you know, the over scripts and the conferencing. And, you know, in the session that I did, I talked about, you know, we've created this class to conference pipeline. It's easier to just remove the student and go to the formalized restorative justice conference and manipulate that practice without really understanding, you know, the importance and value of those relationships. So those are some of the things that I've seen in practice that we are now looking at. How can we address it within our school board to change what the outcomes have been? Because right now we have actually created so much harm that there are people who are resistant to even wanting to see restorative justice continue in our board because of the harm that it has done to so many Black and Brown students. And they're like, their experience is so negative that they don't want to have anything to do with it. And that's upsetting to me because it's not what restorative justice was ever meant to be. So we have a lot to do in terms of addressing some of those things around our own bias and our own implementation where whiteness has played out. And we'll get into think a little bit more about that as we go on today. And so I will stop there and I will pass it to Sheryl.
So Skye, thank you for that. And there'll be some things that I'll say that'll riff off of what you said. But the first thing that comes to mind that kind of connects to what you said about the ways that restorative practices goes from a classroom to conference kind of model. We were talking about this before, and I just feel like that's a way of weaponizing restorative justice. It's not a way that restorative justice was intended to be in the ways of community building. We still are in the space of talking about, and I am guilty as well, of talking about restorative practices as the cure to school discipline, you know, like how to get your students in line so that they will behave. And it's really a disservice to the values that restorative justice is rooted in, especially thinking about the Indigenous communities that this came from. And I think about the different ways that I've been able to interface with schools around the country. I didn't start out as an educator. I started out as more of a practitioner working with systems, mainly the criminal justice system, when I became a restorative justice practitioner. And as I started to do work in schools, I started out in some ways just as I remember when I was in graduate school, it was a way of me making ends meet to serve as a substitute teacher. I got really good at it. I should say that I'm a daughter of a third grade teacher. So some of my orientation to being a K-12 educator comes naturally through my mother. But in that journey, I remember clearly being placed in some classrooms where some people wanted me as a long-term substitute teacher. And I remember one of the most powerful experiences that I had was working in a room with students with special needs. They were all of them were African-American boys. So that alone right there set me up. And then it triggered me. I'm a mother of two African-American boys. And so I'm thinking about these boys that could be my sons. And I'm also remembering that the other teachers that teach students with special needs at this particular school were all white women. And some of the ways that I connected with these boys, they acted as if they were starved for and I'm saying this in a way that I'm thinking about the ways that we build community. They were starved for um, the ways that we connect in community, and ways that if I am a mother, I can mother in some ways these boys. And I just got the impression from the ways that they were treated that they were just starved for that connection. And also knowing too that they knew that I saw them. I knew people like them. They could be my sons. And I treated them with that respect. And we had a wonderful connection, even though it was probably some of the hardest work that I ever did, if one can imagine, just because of the various needs that each student had. But I will tell you, it stays with me to this day, and that was probably 20 years ago, when I was a young practitioner. But knowing too, in the ways that what was needed, and even then, knowing that I was somewhat of a unique person in the field, with these skills, and very few people in my connection were people that came from my background and looked like me. And I was working in a very white community, very white, predominantly white city. And I will just say that it has always been in my mind that if we are serving communities of color, they need to see us show up. People who look like them, people like me, serving in communities with people who look like me, who come from similar backgrounds, who get it, and not just the look, because that's all immaterial if what you have to offer is not genuine. And so one of my colleagues, and I'm trying to be very cognizant of the fact that it's not just about looking at looking the part and having the credentials, but it is about really understanding culture, really understanding how the ways that we show up as people who understand and connect in the ways that we get the path that each student is connecting from, that we don't lose sight that that is important, that we see them as who they are, where they come from matters, what their beliefs are matter. And that isn't always the way education has happened in the United States. I know for me that didn't happen. And so I want to hold that up. And I know that that is something, if we are embodying what this is in terms of the practice, then we're going to honor the traditions of the people that come into our classrooms. And we're not going to try to downplay things that we don't understand. Mm. And we approach it with curiosity. And I know I can be just as guilty as a Black woman buying into white ideals to keep my job, to follow the plan so that I can just live to fight another day. And I want to get out of that trajectory. I want to help others. That's part of why I do the work that I do now, as I work more in higher ed, but I also get the opportunity, as I said before, to train educators in the state of Kansas and restorative practices around the state. And if I can support this ideal by talking about it, giving more tools, I'm going to do that. And I feel like that is a place that is living in that space is very important to me at this point, at this juncture. So I'll pass now to Kathy?
Sounds good. Thanks, Cheryl. Thanks so much for those words. And Skye, thank you. I think for me, I mean, I am a product of quintessential whiteness. I grew up with whiteness as a dominant narrative, and it's what I've known all my life. And while I began to interrogate racism much earlier, really seeing whiteness in myself as something that I needed to address is really a recent part of my journey, and I'm really grateful. I think one of the ways that's happened for me was acknowledging racial disparity in our school discipline. I was in grad school and I started studying discipline practices, and my PhD is in educational psychology. I was focusing on motivation, and so in my brilliant mind, it was all about motivation. If we could just motivate kids better, then they behave better, right? And those were my first assumptions. And again, like, I think one of the ways that whiteness shows up and has shown up in my own life as an educator and now as a teacher educator is just assuming that I even know what I need to know in order to make those kinds of claims. My own whiteness blinded me to all of the other factors that are showing up in discipline disparities, so that it seemed easy enough for me to just attribute it to a lack of motivation. That was my blind spot, my blindness. So just beginning to think about the school to prison pipeline and racial disparities in discipline, and the more I dug, the more I just realized and learned how much our icky, punitive models of discipline were impacting students, particularly Black and Brown students. And so I began as a grad student looking for other alternatives, like what are alternatives to punitive models, and stumbled really in this crazy story. You should ask me sometime about how I learned about restorative justice. It's a funny story, but just inadvertently ran across it one day. And fortunately, a cousin had just learned about, or had finished graduating from CJP, the Center for Justice and Peace Building here in Harrisonburg, Virginia. And we started talking about restorative justice. And I asked if anybody was doing anything like that in schools. And she pointed me to Judy Mullett's work and Lorraine Stutzman's work and Howard Zehr's work. And so I began reading about restorative justice. And it wasn't until later that I began to look at restorative justice as so much more than just an alternative to school discipline. And one of the ways that that showed up for me was, again, realizing how disproportionality in school discipline shows up, and beginning to think more deeply about that. And again, one of the ways that whiteness shows up is in its logic. Jasmine's story in 2018, I suppose, in Denver, the NACRJ conference, named problems in education. And this had a profound impact on me. She talked about hierarchies, our desperate need to keep the world organized in hierarchical structures, and then our complete dependence on individualism. And then finally, and this phrase sticks with me today, even right now, the detethering of the soul. And so when I think about the ways in which Western ideologies have influenced our education system, I think that all three of those things are ways in which whiteness hinders not just restorative justice in education, but education practices in general. Our insistence on hierarchies, who's at the top, who has the knowledge, that can go to credentialing, that can go to adults, where we dismiss the voices and the perspectives of youth. It can go to race and who gets privileged in our conversations. But hierarchies, I think, is one of the ways in which whiteness shows up and really hurts our restorative justice work. Individualism. One of the things that's so true to me about restorative justice work is our need for collective work. Like I need Sheryl and Skye in my life. I need their input. It's not that we need to diversify in order to look better. Like I need their perspectives. I need holistic understandings of things that I just don't have without people who come from different cultural backgrounds, different racial identities, different sexualities and genders. Like I need those diverse perspectives. And so when I run into restorative justice as a rugged individual, I miss things. I'm blind in the same way that I assumed that motivation, what was missing for our students who were struggling with behaviors. And then the detethering of the soul. I did a paper on Descartes, and I essentially blamed Rene Descartes for all that was wrong in Western education systems. But I think what we see, and Skye, you alluded to this earlier, and I was really grateful to hear this, but like what we see in our Western philosophical thing is this, like, here's the mind, here's the body, here's behaviors, here's knowledge. And if we just do these in separate, in these components, then we'll eventually get to the whole. And so what happens there is education becomes about educating the minds of our students and forget their bodies, forget their emotions. And yet restorative justice brings to this, like we are whole. And so I think whiteness has really hindered our ability to work holistically as a community and in collaboration with one another. So yeah, separating out the body, the heart, and the mind, and truncating all of those things and missing the ways in which they are all integrated. And what that can do is it can say that this is about a student's behavior. And then we miss how it impacts and how it has been impacted by their hearts or their bodies. And so those things don't work. And so I think whiteness has really damaged our understanding of education and by default, their restorative justice in education. And I shall pass the talking piece to Dorothy. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy and Skye and Sheryl. Yeah, how has whiteness impacted restorative justice to date from my perspective? And there's a couple of things that Sheryl and Skye mentioned that really point to the culture of education, right? I think the culture of education is very narrow, right? And so that whole traditional school approach, where students' voices are silenced, I think is central to how whiteness has impacted restorative justice. And for me, if I think back to how I was introduced to restorative justice, it was introduced to me as being something for me. And so I pick up on what you said, Kathy, the hierarchy, right? Restorative justice and how I experience professional learning or training. I think it was training, not professional learning. So Skye, I have the same issue with that term, training. It was presented as this would make my life better as an educator, right? And ultimately what I was then encouraged to do was it will help me to control the students better. And I bought into that. I bought into that because that was the way I had been raised. That was my life. That was my culture. And so restorative justice over the years has brought me to an understanding, a deeper understanding that we need to see who our students are. And I think that our westernized system of education has not, I mean, it was never designed to see the student. It was designed as as an industrial approach to create people who would work in factories, right? And I don't think we've ever lost that, though there are glimmers of hope. And so that, that whole analogy of, we don't know the air that we're in, or if you were a fish, you you don't know the water that you're swimming in. Ultimately, I think for restorative justice education, as Skye indicated, it has its roots in Indigenous and Afro-Indigenous understanding of community. But how was it introduced to education originally? It was about, let's reduce suspensions and expulsions. It had nothing to do with community, right? So in terms of how has whiteness impacted restorative justice, I think that especially our earlier understandings of restorative justice education as addressing behavior really created an incredibly weak and default, a weak foundation. And I think what we're seeing nowadays is the impact of that weak foundation. And so, yeah, we are, as you said, Sheryl, we play down what we don't understand. And I'll just, an example that I have, I'm the director of an organization here in Newfoundland and Labrador called Relationships First. And in the beginning stages of that, and it's about 10 years old now, 9 years old now, and we're limping along. We're definitely limping along. And in the early stages, I really wanted to make sure that we had a diverse advisory board, and we were working with different groups and so on. But that wasn't strong in me. I knew we had to do that, but it wasn't strong. And we reached out to different Indigenous leadership groups and so on, and they didn't come on board. And in hindsight now, I wish that we had known to say, then we can't go ahead. We have to work on building better relationships. We can't go ahead with this. But in my privilege, I said, well, you know what? Let's just move ahead and do the best we can, and we'll see how things unfold, right? And I think that's privilege. That's how whiteness shows up when we don't take the time to find the leadership in marginalized communities to teach us what community is. When we are in a westernized approach that has idolized individualism. And so it feels like whiteness is in every cell of my body. And it feels like every time I work with restorative justice education, I am needing to fight against something, and that's okay. So just acknowledging that we're already at quarter after whatever hour it is. We're all at different time zones, so I don't know. But yeah, so maybe let's just open it up for a back and forth, Skye and Sheryl and Kathy, in terms of what did you hear? So for everybody else here, we haven't rehearsed this conversation, by the way. You know, we just said, let's pose these questions and we'll see what happens. And we're trusting we'll know what to say and how to listen. So maybe just open it up for a little bit.
I'm just,
Go ahead, Sheryl.
I'll just say one of the things that struck me, Dorothy, about what you just shared is just thinking about something I wrote in my chapter about just how our everyday reality is hyper racialized. Whites get to dictate what people of color can't do, though we are doing exactly the same things they do. Just the idea that you are, as a white person, able to dictate the plan, to dictate, you know, who gets to show up. And this is something that is a universal thing that happens in communities in general related to race, the ways that race shows up, you know, the ways that we're reminded of our place. And I think about that often in this field. There has been a way that we have implemented, the ways that we have trained, the ways that we have introduced the topic, even the ways that we define it. one of the things that I believe the whole, uh, the whole idea of colorizing restorative justice came out of the fact that restorative justice does not necessarily include us all the time when we're talking about what this is. And the very definition of restorative justice needs to be expanded to be more inclusive on that level. And so those are some of the things that came into my head as you were talking about, uh, as you were sharing earlier. I'll stop there, Skye. And
Yeah, thank you, Cheryl. Sorry, I have teenage boys who are coming in and out of the house hungry constantly, trying to find a quiet space, but it doesn't always work. Yeah, I was just going to say too, when we're talking about whiteness and what whiteness is, and thinking about it as, culturally, thinking about white supremacy culture, not about, our white skin. I think that's important for us to remember as we're talking through these conversations. And, when I think about that and the culture of whiteness, we have all grown up in systems of whiteness, including myself. And I think I learned to adapt in different ways because I wanted to be successful, right? So I was willing to not speak out if I wanted to. I wasn't going to share a lot about my identity. And I wasn't going to talk about those struggles in the class because oftentimes I wouldn't necessarily feel that there was a connection with my teacher to understand my own lived experiences and what I grew up with. And I also didn't feel that, that sense of empowerment or recognizing, the resistance and the challenges and obstacles that my parents faced as being opportunities to see what was possible for me and articulating that in a classroom space where I felt safe to do that. And I think when we're not doing that and we're suppressing those conversations, it's limiting the opportunities for Black and brown bodies to really see who they are within that space. They will conform because they want to be successful. And there is often a fear that if they don't, then there's going to be, resistance and challenge and opposition to that because we haven't created spaces where their voices can be amplified. And so when we think of whiteness, a lot of the times when I think of, school systems and how it works, there's so many different things, whether it be, microaggressions or the normalization of whiteness and looking at textbooks and curriculum and thinking, well, this has worked for me. This has benefited a majority of our students. But if those students are predominantly white and your textbooks are predominantly white, it will benefit them because that's all they know, right? And even I always say, if you're in a school that's 95% white, that doesn't mean that your curriculum and text should be just about whiteness or white culture. In fact, it should be even more so about ensuring that there is cultural diversity in that. And then when we think about restorative justice, we want to ensure that we're not monetizing a practice. We're not looking at a practice and saying, how can I profit off of this? Or how can I even take the ideas that have been brought forward from Indigenous communities and Black leaders and use that and say that that is our own intellectual property? That is another way that whiteness is amplified, is when we take, the lived experiences and the stories and the research done by Black and brown bodies and say, and not give them the credit for that work. And so the other thing that I've often seen too is the use of the words without the action. I tweeted about this several weeks ago, and I used the example of the emperor who wears new clothes. And I said, we don't want to be the equity emperor. And, there's the whole fairy tale about, the emperor who's so filled with pride, he's walking down the middle of the street thinking he's wearing this beautiful robe and he's completely naked. He made a see-through robe and everybody is laughing and he thinks they're cheering for him because he's so filled with pride. And so as restorative justice practitioners, we don't want to be an equity emperor where we're using the words, we're thinking we're doing the right thing, but we're not actually doing meaningful action to create change that is actually including and inclusive of the communities that we've harmed and oppressed so often. And so if we want to shift, people will say, what do we do then? Like, if we have whiteness within our systems, how do we change that? We really have to think about our system, our hiring practices, whatever structure that you're working in, whether you are, a restorative justice consultant, what are the diverse voices that you are working and connecting with to ensure that you are being culturally safe and culturally humble with the work that you are doing? And then we have to think about it from a very race conscious and anti-oppressive lens. We need to ensure that we are understanding that those lived experiences are bringing trauma into our classroom spaces. And how does that affect our relationships with our students? I'm reading Joe Brummer's book right now. Joe, I'm about halfway through it. And it's so good. And there's a few things that actually really even hit me because of even the trauma that I saw within the youth correctional facility, and not even ever really being supported on my own trauma that I experienced from their stories. But what do we know about the oppressive practices that have existed in school spaces that have led to students, feeling challenged about who they are in our classroom spaces and having that identity? And then the last thing I would say is that, oftentimes our relationships with students have become very, very conditional. As long as the student behaves and follows the expectations that are in my class and falls in line with that, then we are good. But as soon as there is challenges, it's like, oh, here he goes again. Here she goes again. Here's this student again, rolling their eyes even before they've had the student in class because they've heard about what they were like the year before. Right? When we have conditional relationships with our students, as opposed to seeing that there is a need there, that there's a want to actually have somebody who actually cares about them, it doesn't matter what restorative practices we're going to do, it's not going to work. And part of that is because of the infiltration of whiteness, we haven't even understood or begin to dive into the complexities of what it means to be in spaces as Black and brown bodies where we don't feel seen and we don't feel a part of the school community. And so that is something we really need to think about, to reflect on, and be willing to sit back and say, you know what? I don't know everything about this. I need to understand. And sometimes it's about me being silent and listening in order to do what we can to really dismantle and disrupt oppressive practices that are centered on whiteness.
Yes. Thank you. You're talking about trauma and the conditional relationships that we have with students and the ways in which whiteness is perpetuated. And one of the ways is by maintaining a system that says, here is what behavior should look like, and here's what's acceptable, and here's what's not. And as a white person, as long as what you're doing helps me maintain that hierarchical system of me being in charge, and it privileges my comfort and my expectations of what the world should look like, and not leaving room for our students to challenge that. And so when I was a special ed teacher, I often taught students who had labels of emotional and behavior disorders, like that was the word, right? And I won't even use that with my students now when I teach about emotional challenges. Like, there are challenges that are real, and there are behavior challenges that are real. But who decided that that was a disorder or a dysfunction, right? White people did that. Based on some expectation of white behavior, of normalized behavior. And so in perpetuating what counts as appropriate and not, and all of those things, and just refusing to see that there's a different way of looking at those things. And y'all, I did that as a special ed teacher. Like, we had in the central office, there were kids with ED labels and BD labels had white folders, and I perpetuated that. There's a white folder with that kid's name on it somewhere. That very dehumanizing practice of naming a child by those behaviors, and just the expression of those dominant mentalities and hierarchies. Yeah.
I think a couple of things that I'm hearing that really resonate with me are that this incredible encouragement to continue to control, right? And whether that be by having certain color folders for certain color, disorders or whatever we call them, or whether it's, where educators are afraid, as you said, Skye, to have a conversation, to have a topic, a circle topic that really gets at things that they care about, right? And how often do educators make a decision to go, I'm not doing that topic because I don't want to, you know, there's that fear of what the students will say. And rather than digging deep into what's making me afraid of opening this up, because the students, if the students want to have that conversation, you know, then what's stopping me from allowing that? And the way we stop it from the way we stop allowing that is by always by not giving them the freedom to come up with the topic, right? Or modeling topics that are all very light as opposed to in-depth, so that the students don't feel like it's safe to come up with a in-depth topic to have a conversation about. And then I really appreciated what you said, Skye, about terminology. You know, like when we're using, you know, the term relationships, I don't know, I use it a lot, but how do I understand that term and still put boundaries around that so that relationships are conditional? And I grew up with that, right? And I grew up in a home in which 7 children. My parents, you know, they meant well, they loved us. I don't doubt that they loved us, but there was always the threat, especially as teenagers, that if we didn't comply, we would get kicked out of the house. And I remember thinking how terrible that was, right? And at the time, and just being so afraid of getting kicked out of the house, or watching one of my siblings get kicked out of the house. And I watched it happen, you know, more than once. And then I thought, you know what? We've kind of come past that today, but guess what? We haven't at all. Because our students, how do they talk about being in class? Like you said about the classroom to conference pipeline, right? They are getting kicked out of class. They are getting kicked out of school. They're being told, like, the thing that was damaging for me as a child was observing my siblings getting kicked out of the house and then going, what the heck? Where then do you belong? Where then do you belong? And students getting kicked, like my son, when he got kicked out of school for a day or two, you know, I'm going like, you know, he's being told that he doesn't belong. And Sheryl, you picked up on that, you know, in terms of that being the culture, right? The students were starved for connection. So what is it that we actually still allow for suspensions to happen using that terminology of being kicked out, right? And I know that it can be pretty rampant in certain schools. But so maybe we should move on from here. But and Skye, you started to get at this, and that is, what do we mean by whiteness? And how do I, as a person who is white, who has European descent, you know, settler Canadian, how do I understand who I am when we talk about whiteness? And as you said, Skye, we all have grown up in this whiteness. So I'll put that out there for whoever wants to pick that up.
I would like to just read just a small text from Sheryl's chapter in Colorizing Restorative Justice, if that's okay. Whiteness has to hold all the power. Whiteness is different from having white skin, but people with white skin have been experientially conditioned since birth to take on a mindset and behavior patterns of white supremacy, the arrogance, the greediness, the privilege, the presumed superiority, and the entitlement and stolen power to own, control, dominate, exclude, and harm others. This mindset is whiteness, and it's what needs to be called out. Thank you, Sheryl, for those words.
although I picture them in a comical sense of the greed, the,
Oh.
no, I'm sorry, but
Shall
this
I
is,
reread it with more drama?
no, I'm joking. I'm totally joking. It just sounded so serious, and yeah, but I I think that experience was stemming from something that happened to me in a lived experience where I was noting the space that someone was taking up on a plane seat next to me. A white woman came and sat. I was on the very back of the plane. If you've ever sat at the very back of the plane, there is a seat that is in the corner that is a half seat. And I am not a small person, but I managed to put myself in that seat. And the woman who came and sat next to me, a white woman, just began to spread out. She took both of the armrests, she took and just made, and I felt like the whole flight was this jockeying for my own, just to hold my own space. And it hit my brain that that is what this exercise is when we are trying to dismantle something that is in a predominantly white space. It is the process of dismantling. It isn't, we use this word as we were having discussion, coddling. If we coddle something, we we hold it, we put it in a place that is carefully placed, and we make sure that there are no hurt feelings and all of that. And I think that's part of what happens in the ways that we try to move whiteness from the center, the decentering, in my mind. But really, what it requires is a dismantling. And the only way that that happens is if we get our minds wrapped around the ways that that looks and permeates. And if something permeates, you can't coddle it off. You have to really work at removing it. And I think that's part of what is painful. It's messy. It 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 is not something for the faint of heart. And it will also, and what I've learned is when I have been in situations where I've had to call it out and name things, it's made me sometimes not friendly with those people who were once my allies. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I was going to say too that, when we talk about whiteness, it becomes so pervasive and so embedded and entrenched in our culture that we can't, it's almost like you don't see it or you don't want to see it because oftentimes, for one, it's comfortable. It's comfortable for a lot of people who have, come through a system where it's worked and benefited for them. 80 to 90% of educators were good students, right? You have a small percentage that were bad students, and what the word, and I say that in brackets, but that's how people would identify them, because they didn't conform to that system, right? And so when you have educators who the system benefited them, then to think about, well, I'm now an educator, I'm going to adapt those same principles that worked and benefited me. How is it that me as an educator is a problem versus the student when it worked for myself? And I think that's something that we have to shift our thinking around and understand that even for myself, as I said before, as a Black student, you learn to code switch. You learn to have, what's referred to as double consciousness, because you are trying to conform to a system that allows you to be successful. It's not necessarily that you like the way the system operates. It's just that's what you do to conform and assimilate to ensure that you can get to be successful without penalty or without punishment. And so I think the challenge a lot of the times when we think about whiteness is that people can't understand that they have to rethink and reshift their own teaching practice because how we've done it for years is not working. right? And so when, I think the challenge within, a lot of school boards right now is when anti-Black racism is brought up, people will say, especially this is more of a Canadian thing too, is it's not that bad. Like, things are not as bad as you think. It actually, it really is more of the student, or it's more of that issue, even with a colleague or an educator. It's not that bad. We're not the US. Some people will go as far as to say that, right? And because it's more subtle, I think it's actually more harmful, because it's not until people, when you think of a kid who's calling their mom and they'll say, mom, and she's busy and she's doing something, until they explode and they're like, mom, like, they've tried so much to do it calmly and that's not working. That's where that activism is coming from. It's almost like we have tried to say that the system is not working for Black students. The system is not working for brown bodies. The system isn't working for communities that are coming from marginalized neighborhoods. And people say, well, we can just adjust and fix a little bit here. We'll just twist this a little bit, but we'll still kind of adapt a system that benefits what we consider to be most people, even though we don't really know if that's beneficial for all. And because we are doing that, we're not willing to make the shift and the changes that are really needed, like things around hiring practices and ensuring that there is representation, like looking at, what our courses are in our curriculum, looking at how we are implementing restorative practices. We just want to touch on it because that is still comfortable for us, as opposed to saying, you know what, we need to speak up and say, this is not okay. This is not okay because our students are not being successful. Our students don't see themselves. Our students are craving a Black educator to be in their classroom. I just had a student 2 weeks ago that said, Miss, I'm 19 years old now. And I said, and I'm struggling to finish. And you were the first Black teacher that I've ever had, right? The first Black teacher. And she articulated that and was challenged with the fact that, why is this happening for me? Why haven't I had an opportunity to connect more? And so we have to think about things very differently, because like how Fanya Davis has said, the status quo is racism. The status quo means that we are not allowing everyone to be successful in our school systems, and we are complicit in that. And so we really need to reflect on those practices, even when it's difficult and challenging. And, we speak up and people might be like, I don't get you. I don't understand what you're saying. You're not speaking up for you. You're speaking up for all the voices of students who haven't been successful in a classroom that was oppressive, right? And that's what we have to keep in front and center in our mind.
And I would just thank you so much for those insights. And I just want to pick up the idea around the difference between decentering and interrogating, or as Sheryl, you put forward, dismantling, right? And Kathy and I, when we started talking about this as a possibility, we were talking about decentering whiteness. And then we had another person who was going to be on this panel, Sylvia Moore, and she very quietly said, it's not about decentering, it's about interrogating. And that was about 2 weeks ago. And I have not, I'm very uncomfortable a lot lately, but that's when I went, all right, what does it mean to interrogate whiteness? What am I doing in that? And it is about dismantling and the dominant tendency to make a little change here and make a little change there and try to satisfy the rumbling voices or the explosive voices. In grappling with what is interrogating whiteness, I realize more and more, as we did talk about last night, that there's no way to do it in a safe way. It's not about being safe. And so, like Sheryl, you said, we have to stop thinking that this can be done in a coddling way. And I think that as somebody who is white, I gravitate towards wanting to be coddled. So let me just, let's just decenter this. But decentering whiteness will allow it to exist on the margins. And I'm going it cannot exist on the margins. And I know it can mean different things in different contexts, but so I've been grappling with, what does it mean to interrogate whiteness? And that difference between whiteness and being a person who is white, and trying to figure out what my responsibility is for calling out, right? And so one of the experiences I had in the fall was I teach social studies at a master's level as well as undergrad level. And one of the things that I decided to do for the master's course was to throw all the readings out that had been there and to only pick readings by Black, Indigenous, and people of color. That was such a challenge. That was such a challenge first to find the readings. And I thought, this is ridiculous that I have to look this hard because I know they're there. And sure enough, they're there, right? But so that, like, how do I interrogate whiteness so that dismantling can happen? And I think in restorative justice education, we need to be brave enough. This is not about safe spaces. This has to be about brave spaces where we can actually say, how do we, first of all, identify the whiteness in restorative justice? And then how do we get rid of that whiteness or that white privilege? You know what, we have 15 minutes left. And I think the four of us have put out a lot of ideas. What do you think, Sheryl or Skye or Kathy? Shall we open it up and make it, a group conversation at this point?
Yeah, Annie has a great question that I was going to bring up that I could read, and we can maybe discuss that. She just said, I've always thought of the scripted nature of the formal conference as a way to ensure that both parties get asked the same questions despite our biases. I've seen loosely structured conferences where the bias of the panel gave more airtime and different questions to the privileged party. What are your thoughts on this, and how do we remove the whiteness from the conference while still ensuring equity in the question answering? So this is something that we're talking about right now in our board as we're, trying to readdress, conferencing. And this is actually a perfect example of decentering and interrogating whiteness, right? I think, the challenges when we set up the formal conference is that we're looking at, all those pre-conference conversations happening as just being, the students that have been involved. But we really need to think about the pre-conference for those who are facilitating the conference as well, right? Are they ready, willing, and prepared to do this? And what is their bias that they may be bringing into that conference? And that's where that whole interrogation process needs to happen. And that can be challenging because sometimes it's an administrator who wants to do the conference and has said, I'm prepared to do it. And then how do you address that? It's interesting, Denise is on the call right now and we're doing some work together in her board, and there's some, some challenges, that we're coming across with some of the work that we're doing. And I think sometimes you have to get a bit creative with it in terms of how can you bring in other people too that might be supporting that conference, that may be better prepared to facilitate that conference in order to ensure that the questions, there isn't bias to one side of the conversation. And that bias usually means that, again, a Black or a brown student tends to be implicated more than whoever else is involved. So I think what we first need to find out and ask is, who is involved with facilitating that conference? Are they the right person for it? And who else might we need to get involved with that process in order to ensure that if it is more loosely structured, that those questions are not biased, because structure for some is not going to feel authentic. That was the risk that happened with us when I was in the youth correctional facility. Our most powerful restorative conferences were not structured where it was like, here are the questions, we're going to go through these. What happened? What were you thinking at the time? It wasn't that formal, but we asked those questions within it, but it really was a conversation. And that takes the ability and capacity to have an effective relationship with the people involved. So I'm going to stop there and let somebody else kind of share to their perspective on that.
Well, I just want to raise awareness too that because whiteness is so baked into all that we do, like we can't just change questions in order to avoid implicit bias, right? Just having a set of questions isn't going to ensure that that implicit bias isn't going to be there. And so ongoing conversations about implicit bias, ongoing conversations where people are given opportunities to interrogate their own whiteness that's baked into their way of being. So like just thinking always about, where am I showing up thinking hierarchically? Where am I detethering from my soul? Where am I focusing on rugged individualism or power or things like that? And creating spaces where we can do that work in an ongoing kind of way, because it will affect everything. And so it's not restorative justice if we're not talking about justice or something like that. So ongoing. Sheryl, you were unmuted.
Sorry, Cheryl. I was going to say something.
I'll just say quickly that I guess in the ways that I think about this, I'm wondering about the holistic way that, again, if we're talking about something that was given to us in a way that it wasn't structured, and we add all of the structure to it, and then we call it wrong if we step outside of the lines. To me, interrogating whiteness is liberating what is human in all of us. And to me, that process has to happen in ways that we trust that the process works, that we know we're holding space for people to share their truths. And sometimes we get in our own way because we feel like we've got to tell people how to tell the truth, instead of allowing what comes up to be okay enough to hold space for that journey of both of all parties in a particular conflict to surface and find that common ground. And I think we are afraid. I think that there's fear around that, to create that structure, to tamper it down, because that in essence keeps us in our lanes and keeps us safe. And I say that with air quotes. And I'll stop there. Belinda, you wanted to share something.
I was just thinking, it was a conversation I was having with one of my daughters recently about some of these things. And it wasn't picking up on the questions. I don't think it's just about what questions we ask and whether the questions have got bias. It's also recognizing people's comfort with answering. So it picks it up on what you were just saying, Sheryl, that if people have had their own voice suppressed for a long, long time, and then they're asked a question, they're not necessarily as able or as comfortable or as confident to express themselves as somebody who's used to being listened to and being honored. And so it's not just what questions we ask and how we ask them and who we ask, but how much support and encouragement and opportunity we get to, to use Skye's word, amplify voices that have not been heard. And that is maybe about race, but I'm also thinking, and I've been thinking all evening about gender and other things. We could have a whole nother conversation around the intersectionality of being a white woman and a black woman, and how women's voices are being suppressed, and how you balance that in a meeting, a restorative meeting between a male and a female, and all that stuff. It's not just about the questions, it's about how those answers are, how the opportunity for those answers to be expressed is also feeds into that.
Yeah, I would echo that, Belinda. And so when we talk about what is whiteness, whiteness is colonization. Whiteness is imperialism. Whiteness is those structures. And so it's not just about race. It's about gender. It's about religion. It's about socioeconomic status. And so we're talking about whiteness in a context of anti-Blackness and so on in our particular environment right now. But I think ultimately, I guess personally, I think about it less as I don't think about it as much as whiteness as I think about it as colonization. And so when it's about colonization, then all of those other oppressions also fit into that. And I think that there's I guess some ways of moving forward into deeper truths if we understand that it's about a whole context. And so, Annie, your question about the questions, I think is a very important question, because you know what, maybe if in your particular context you have developed a way, you have developed relationships with the community of students or people that you're working with, and those questions actually are respectful. Like, it's about what are those questions grounded in, right? And I think we have to interrogate if they are grounded in power, right? So that the child who is never asked a question is suddenly expected to respond. Or what in the world is going on that we don't ask the people involved what if they want to make the questions? Why aren't we asking them what questions do they want to ask? Or I've always been troubled by the whole thing of, in order, and I think this is a very white construct, in order for people to be able to participate in a conference to address harm, somebody has to take responsibility for causing the harm. I go like, what the, I could swear about that. If that's a condition for having a conversation, where is that coming from? Where is that coming from? So, yeah.
And I think the challenge is too with restorative practices, it's always been about decentering not just whiteness, but power. And I think that's another challenge that we see even with any type of oppression that exists, especially in school systems, but wherever restorative practices is used, is to deconstruct our position and power, because that always is going to throw things off with any type of conference that you do, because you're already coming in with either a preconceived idea of the outcome of the conference or a preconceived idea of who is involved and who's been impacted in the conference. Right. And so, Dorothy, I think what you said, even about allowing those who are in the conference to be able to be involved with selection of the questions, right? And how that conversation is going to be guided is important. But that really takes administrators, educators, people in these positions to decenter their own power and say, you know what, this isn't about me. This isn't about trying to check off a box to say that we've done it, or to even check off a box and say, we'll just do this so that they're not suspended and it looks good on my portfolio, but to really be about doing it to say, you know what, how do I better connect with everybody that's been impacted to really establish authentic community and decenter my own position and whatever identity that I'm bringing into this space in order to hear the voices of those who have been impacted and to bring restoration into those relationships. And I think that power part really needs to be emphasized, because there's too many who are just like, yeah, I've been doing this, I know what I'm doing. And as soon as they have that projection, that is going to impact any type of relationship you have.
Can I ask a follow-up, Dorothy, about your comment about asking someone to take responsibility before starting? I know as only doing schoolwork, I've never been one to make them, what is it? They have to also feel sorry. People say, oh, they have to feel sorry before they enter into restorative conversation. Well, children don't feel, they need to see the other person, they need to have that interaction, and then it doesn't even occur to them that they've even impacted someone else typically. So can you talk a little bit more about that idea that they don't need to take responsibility ahead of time, because usually that ends up with two students, just nobody's taking any responsibility for anything, and we're in this dance and we don't come with, open. It's really hard for the other person to hear if someone doesn't at least start with, I know, so I'll stop talking, but I just want to hear a little more about that.
No, thanks, Laura. I guess one of the ways that I think about that is I never required that students say that they were responsible, or I mean, I would expect that through the conference, it would become clearer who carried what responsibility, and, if there's, how do I feel if somebody tells me you have to be sorry for what you did? Good grief. If anything that makes you push back, it would be that. But I always thought about it more as asking people, were you involved in this in any way? And if you're involved, are you interested in engaging in a conversation that will help us understand what's going on here? So for me, the requirement was more about admitting that there was involvement, not responsibility. And I don't know, like in my interrogating my whiteness, I'm actually asking myself, what, does that make sense or does that not make sense? But that's, for myself, my framework has always been, because I was challenged early in my restorative justice journey, to recognize red flags when I observed conferences or I was part of conferences. I had been challenged early to say who's benefiting and who's bearing the burden. And so that has been the lens that I've looked at. And so any of those things, like, you have to take responsibility in order to participate in a conference, right? I'm going like, who's benefiting from that? Who's benefiting? That's so that we can get through it more quickly. There's no benefit there for the people involved, right? And so that has always helped me, but it hasn't necessarily stopped me from just wanting the convenience of getting through certain things. But the other thing is that, we have kind of moved into this space now of restorative justice as a response to, harm. And I think all four of us in the circle know that it's about the community. It's about how we are living together as community, right? And one small aspect of that is when difficult things happen and when harm happens. I want to acknowledge that it's 3 minutes after the 90 minutes. And I think probably, I don't know what the other three of you think, but I wonder if maybe we should close in a good way. And then if people want to stay on, then we can further, like I can be here for a little while yet, but I don't know. What do you think, Skye or Sheryl or Kathy? Does that work for you? Yeah.
That works.
Sheryl, did you have something that?
That's something.
Okay, perfect. So
Yeah.
I'm going to hand it over to you. Cheryl's going to close us out, but feel free to stay around.
So this has been wonderful, and I'm so glad to see faces from around the world here. And I wrestled with what to share. It came to me that one of the ways that we have been inspired of late in the United States, following a just unbelievable beginning of this year, in the ways that we have been traumatized by what many people called an insurrection on the Capitol steps. And then at the end of January, having an inauguration that was peaceful. And there was this bright, beautiful, amazing woman, young woman, in this bright yellow that gave this amazing poem. And I would love to read an excerpt from this poem to close us out. From The Hill We Climb by Amanda Gorman. And I'm just reading the last few lines. But she says, "We will rebuild, reconcile, and recover, and every known nook of our nation and every corner called our country, our people, diverse and beautiful, will emerge, battered and beautiful. When the day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it, for there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it. If only we're brave enough to be it." Thank you, everyone.